The judicial branch of our government is not decided by the people. It is decided by the members of Congress and the President. These are lifelong appointments that have far-reaching consequences. Justices nominated to Supreme Court should have an established term limit. I've done a decent amount of research on this subject, and I'd like to share the research I've done and my point of view, which is pro-term limits. The Supreme Court is the highest judicial body in the United States. Every year they weigh in on important hot-button issues that have considerable impact on our daily lives. These individuals who are nominated, should they be able to serve in the position with decades without change? Once you get appointed in, should they just be there until they decide to quit, which could be 40, 50 years from now? Is this relevant to America's changing demographic? Because America is constantly in flux. And if we're keeping the same people in there for so long, does that really match what America is and what America stands for? So, Congress specifically has become so politicized lately that it's turned politics into a weapon. They use political party to vote yay or nay on many subjects, including whether or not to nominate a justice. They don't vote on character necessarily or what the person is qualified for, but it depends on if they have an R or D by their name. So establishing term limits would cause more diversity. So you'd be having a more highly rotated cast of individuals. And different countries utilize term limits, so it's not a new radical thing. It's something that countries use. Did our founding fathers take into consideration political party when drafting our Constitution? Did they imagine such divisive party lines? So the judicial branch is an isolated branch. We don't really see what's going on behind the scenes. All we really hear about is after they make a decision. Then we finally hear something about them. But how a judicial nominee gets into office is through the president nominates someone, and then the Senate votes yay or nay on whether or not to have that person become a Supreme Court member. The American people in general are not involved whatsoever. So that's one reason why you have to pay attention to who we vote into office. Congress interviews potential nominees. The focus has been shifting to political party as outlined in this graph. This graph is by Basinger, Scott J., and Maxwell Mack. It comes from the new normal in the Supreme Court confirmation voting hyperpartisanship in the Trump era. In this graph, you can see the average party loyalty to the left there in percent, and then the decade at the bottom. So as we can see, as the decades go on here, the average party loyalty percentage goes dramatically up till modern day, where it's upper 80s to mid 90s. So these are what our senators and our Congress people are voting strictly down party lines. That's the same thing they do with the nomination process of a justice. They take into consideration political party, where the Supreme Court shouldn't necessarily be taken in as political party. It should be an independent of that, because these are decisions that go beyond the scope of political party. The nomination of a judge is a lifelong appointment. There are no term limits, and they can serve until they die if they wish. So establishing term limits, according to Daniel Himmel in Constructural Changes Fix the Supreme Court, there's an 18-year term limit model that gets floated around that seems to have a lot of popular support. This system allows for a new justice every 2 years, because you can stagger the votes with 9 justices. So it's not that radical, and it's a lengthy appointment still. 18 years is still pretty long. Although there's still very lengthy appointments, the rotation is often, and more candidates will broaden the culture and representation of the 9 justices. So if we're bringing in new people every 2 years, just think about how much more experience we're going to get. Different backgrounds, different perspectives, different life experience. It's going to broaden the cultural representation of the body. And that is a plus any way you cut it. You know, and also, dude, we got to take into consideration the life expectancy. When the founding fathers drafted the Constitution, did they expect people to be working into their 80s and 90s in the Supreme Court? You know, that's something that has to be taken into consideration. There are countries around the world that have implemented some form of term limit to their high court. We can use these as a model. South Africa has a 12-year term limit system. So after 12 years, you know, you're done. You've served your due diligence and you've served your country, so now you can retire in peace. Australia has their constitutional court set up with age limits. So they cut you off at 70 years old, or Parliament can even vote you out if they feel the need to. The point is they have a route out. With us, we nominate them and then they're there for the rest of their life, unless they see fit or an extenuating circumstance, which to my knowledge hasn't happened, where they deem themselves mentally unfit or something. The information about the South African and the Australian governments, that I got that from Brian Opskin in Models of Judicial Tenure, reconsidering life limits, age limits, and term limits for judges. One concern is that legislation will get turned over too often. So if you're rotating members in, then major legislation will get turned over just because of political agenda, I guess the concern is. But you have to have faith in the system and have faith in precedent. That precedent will rule. And also, like, why can't we just experiment? You know, in order to establish term limits, it's going to take an amendment to the Constitution, so that's a fairly big deal, but it's been done before because we've amended the Constitution plenty of times. They're all in there so you can see them. We've done it before. So considering all the information so far, we begin to see term limits as a viable solution. Wrapping up, there are different ways in which to operate our federal judicial system, and the Supreme Court specifically. Establishing term limits is one of those ways. The nomination process has become politically driven and is as divisive as ever. We see our elected representatives voting down party lines. Term limits are not that radical. The presidency uses term limits. You know, there's a 2-4-year term limit. America is a vast, culturally diverse nation and is represented by 9 justices. So we have 9 justices representing the whole of our country. Having term limits will cause a greater rotation, more diversity, more perspective, more life experience flowing. Because the Supreme Court is a pattern. It flows. The people change, but the Supreme Court as an institute stays. So if you have more justices flowing through the institute, you're going to have more life experience, more culture, more diversity. So research suggests the 18-year model. This model provides stability and allows for a rotating, diverse selection of judicial nominees.